Devil's Hollow, Wyoming. Population 843. The kind of town where everyone knows your name, your parents' names, and probably what you had for breakfast. It sits in a valley surrounded by pine forests and abandoned copper mines. The kind of place that feels like it exists outside of time. In the summer of 1998, that feeling became terrifyingly literal. The town got its name from a legend nobody quite remembered the origin of anymore. Some said it was because of the way wind howled through the valley in winter, creating sounds that the first settlers swore were voices. Others claimed it was named after a prospector who went mad in the mines back in the 1800s, raving about something he'd seen in the deepest shaft before he disappeared. But mostly, people just lived with the name and didn't think too much about it. That was before the blackout, before we learned that some names are warnings. It was a Thursday night in late June when the power went out, not unusual for a rural town with aging infrastructure. What was unusual was everything else that went with it. Jenny Matsuda was working the late shift at the Route 26 diner when it happened. She told me later that she'd been pouring coffee for Travis Burke, the night dispatcher, when every light in the place just died. Not a flicker, not a brownout, just instant, complete darkness. The coffee maker stopped mid-brew. The old Wurlitzer jukebox that had been playing Patsy Cline went silent. Even the exit signs went dark, which shouldn't have been possible. They were supposed to have battery backups. Travis's radio, the one he kept clipped to his belt, went dead mid-transmission. He'd been talking to a trucker passing through, giving directions to the gas station, when the voice just stopped. Static stopped. Everything stopped. The lights didn't flicker. They died. All at once. Every house, every street lamp, the gas station, the diner, everything. But it wasn't just the electricity. Car engines that had been idling suddenly choked and died. The payphone outside the post office went silent mid-conversation. Sharon Murphy had been talking to her sister in Cheyenne, and she said the line didn't disconnect. It just went quiet, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire world. Even battery-powered devices, flashlights, radios, watches stopped working. Old man Henderson's pacemaker stuttered. He felt it skip, felt his heart lurch in his chest, and for 4 minutes and 37 seconds, he genuinely thought he was dying. The device kicked back in just as suddenly as it had failed, but those minutes aged him in ways that had nothing to do with his heart. For exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Devil's Hollow existed in complete silence and darkness. The silence was the worst part. That's what people said afterward. In a rural town, you get used to background noise, the hum of electrical transformers, the distant sound of trucks on the highway, dogs barking, the wind. But this was different. This was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. It was a silence that felt deliberate, intentional. Martha Chen, no relation to Tom, despite what people thought, was putting her 3-year-old daughter to bed when the blackout hit. She told the sheriff later that in that darkness, she'd heard her daughter whisper, "Mommy, why did the stars stop singing?" Martha had no idea what that meant. Her daughter couldn't explain it later, but something about those words stuck with all of us when the story got around. Then, just as suddenly, the battery devices came back. Flashlights buzzed to life, their beams cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. Radios crackled with static. Watches resumed ticking, but the main power stayed dead, and the cars wouldn't start. People turned keys in ignitions and got nothing. No click, no whine, just silence. It would be 3 days before the town had electricity again. 3 days that would change everything. Marcus Webb was one of the first to notice something stranger than a simple blackout. Marcus ran a ham radio set up from his garage a hobby he'd maintained since his Air Force days in the early 70s. He'd been stationed in Germany during the Cold War, monitoring Soviet communications, and the habit of listening had never left him. When his equipment came back online, he immediately tried to reach other operators in the region. Casper, Laramie, even Salt Lake if conditions were right. What he got instead was something he'd never heard before in 3 decades of radio operation. Every frequency was flooded. Not with voices or Morse code or even normal static. It was a pattern, rhythmic, pulsing, almost like breathing, followed by short bursts of tones that rose and fell in mathematical precision. And it was everywhere. AM, FM, shortwave, every single frequency was carrying the same signal. Marcus worked his way through the dial, expecting to find gaps, dead zones, something. But no, from the lowest frequencies his equipment could pick up to the highest, the pattern was there. Consistent, unwavering, patient. Marcus recorded it on his old Tascam cassette deck, played it back. The pattern repeated every 43 seconds, always the same, always precise, no variation, no drift. Whatever was generating this signal had accuracy that made atomic clocks look sloppy. He called his fellow operators on the backup landlines that finally started working the next morning. Ed Kowalski in Casper confirmed it. Linda Yamamoto in Laramie heard it too. Even a guy Marcus sometimes talked to in Fort Collins, Colorado, picked it up. The signal was regional, covering roughly a 100-mile radius, with Devil's Hollow at its exact centre. Marcus sat in his garage that first morning, headphones on, listening to the pattern repeat. He'd heard a lot of strange things over the years. Numbers stations broadcasting codes to spies, mysterious pings from submarines, atmospheric phenomena that created ghost signals. But this was different. This had structure, intelligence, and it scared him in a way he couldn't articulate. But before anyone could make sense of the signal, something else happened. Something people could actually see. Chapter 1. The meteor that wasn't. James Carver saw it first. He was driving back from a late shift at the lumberyard, his old Ford pickup rattling along County Road 12, when the sky lit up. A bright streak, brilliant white with hints of blue at the edges, tearing across the darkness above the tree line. His first thought was meteor. You saw them sometimes out here, away from city lights, streaking across the sky in brief flashes of cosmic fire. His second thought, after watching it for several seconds, was that something about it felt wrong. Meteors fall fast. They fragment. They leave trails of sparks and burning debris. They scream through the atmosphere with visible friction, often breaking apart in spectacular fashion before they hit the ground. This thing did none of that. It moved too slowly, like it was descending rather than falling, like something with intention rather than something surrendering to gravity. There was no tail streaming behind it, no fragmentation, no pieces breaking off in glowing arcs, and most unsettling of all, there was no sound. James had seen enough meteors in his 46 years to know what they looked like. This wasn't that. This was controlled, deliberate. He could track its movement as it descended, following its arc with his eyes, watching as it dropped below the horizon with the steady, measured pace of something landing rather than crashing. He pulled over and got out of his truck, boots crunching on the gravel shoulder, watching as the object disappeared beyond the tree line to the east, somewhere deep in the forest near the old Marston mining fields. He waited for an impact sound, an explosion, the crack of trees being torn apart, anything. Nothing came, just silence and the soft rustle of wind through pine needles. The summer air smelled like sap and dry earth. Normal. Everything felt normal, except for the fact that something impossible had just fallen from the sky without making a sound. James stood there for 10 minutes, waiting, watching the forest. The glow from the object had left an afterimage in his vision, a blue-white streak that faded slowly. He considered driving out to the Forest Service road, trying to get closer, but something stopped him. A feeling, instinct honed by years of hunting in these woods. The feeling you got when you were being watched, when you were in the presence of something that didn't want to be disturbed. He got back in his truck and drove home, told his wife Linda what he'd seen. She believed him. James wasn't the type to exaggerate or make things up, but she also convinced him to wait until morning, to call the sheriff when the sun was up, and things made more sense. By morning, half the town was talking about the meteor. Turned out James wasn't the only one who'd seen it. Sarah Kwan, who lived on the eastern edge of town, saw it from her porch. The Brennan twins, Tommy and Michael, were out night fishing at Copper Lake and watched it descend beyond the ridge. Even Pastor Robert Mills saw it, interrupting his late-night sermon preparation to step outside his church and watch the sky light up. The other half of town hadn't seen it and thought the first half was exaggerating. You know how it is in small towns. A shooting star becomes a meteor, becomes a spacecraft, depending on who's telling the story and how many beers in they are. But when the sheriff's office got calls from 6 different people reporting the same thing, describing the same slow descent, the same silent fall, they decided to organise a search party. Not because they thought it was important, but because it gave people something to do during the blackout. And maybe, just maybe, there was something out there worth finding. That's how I got involved. My name is Alex Rivers, and I was home for the summer after my second year studying geology at the University of Montana. I'd grown up in Devil's Hollow, left for college with big plans of never coming back, and then found myself returning every summer anyway. There was something about this place that held on to you, the quiet, the familiarity, the way the mountains looked at sunset. I told myself it was just temporary, that I'd finish my degree and move somewhere important, somewhere with actual geology to study that wasn't just old copper mines and sedimentary rock. When Sheriff Harding asked for volunteers to help search the old mining area, I jumped at the chance. Not because I believed in meteors or alien spacecraft or any of that. I just wanted to see what kind of impact crater a slow-moving object might make. It was the kind of thing that could make for an interesting paper. Maybe even get me some attention from the department. I was 20 years old and still believed that academic recognition mattered more than lived experience. I'd learn otherwise soon enough. There were 8 of us in the search party. Sheriff Harding, a solid man in his 50s who'd run this town with quiet competence for 15 years. His deputy, Ramon Torres, younger by a decade, sharp-eyed and thorough. Marcus Webb, with his radio equipment, still trying to make sense of the signal that wouldn't stop. 3 local volunteers, including a rancher named Bill Hutchins, weathered, practical, the kind of man who could fix anything with duct tape and patience. A high school science teacher named Patricia Lowell, who taught chemistry and physics with genuine passion. And Gregory Marsh, a retired engineer who'd worked on missile systems back in the day and had more questions than anyone about what we might find. And me, the geology student home for the summer, the one who thought he was smart enough to explain anything. We set out at dawn, hiking into the forest with compasses, maps, and a general direction based on witness reports. The morning was cool, mist still clinging to the low spots, dew heavy on the grass. Sheriff Harding had his service weapon, Ramon carried a first aid kit and flares, Marcus had his portable radio gear strapped to a frame pack. We looked like a search and rescue team, heading out to find a lost hiker, except we were looking for something that had fallen from the sky. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I remember Patricia mentioning it first. Where were the birds? It was summer, late June. The woods should have been alive with sound. warblers and chickadees, woodpeckers hammering away at dead trees, crows calling from the canopy. Instead, we walked through silence, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional crack of a branch. Even the insects seemed subdued. No mosquitoes buzzing around our heads, no flies, just stillness and the smell of pine and earth. "This is wrong," Patricia said quietly, adjusting her backpack straps. "I've been hiking these woods for 20 years. I've never heard it this quiet." Gregory nodded, his engineer's mind already working through possibilities. Animals respond to seismic activity sometimes, earthquakes. Maybe whatever landed put out some kind of pressure wave, scared everything off. "Maybe," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. He had his radio out, listening to that strange signal through a small earpiece. The pattern's stronger here, definitely coming from somewhere in this direction. We searched for 3 hours, spreading out in a grid pattern, staying within sight of each other. The Forest Service had cut trails through here decades ago, but they were overgrown now, barely visible under years of deadfall and new growth. We followed compass bearings, called out to each other, marked trees with coloured tape to show where we'd been. Bill found it. He'd been working the northern edge of our search grid when he called out, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite fear, but close to it. "Got something here. You all better come see this." We converged on his location, pushing through a dense thicket of undergrowth that grabbed at our clothes and scratched at exposed skin. And then we were through, standing in a small clearing that shouldn't have existed. The clearing itself was unusual, perfectly circular, about 30 feet across, with the grass pressed flat in a radial pattern, like something had pushed down from above with immense, even pressure. Every blade of grass, every small plant, all bent outward from a central point in perfect geometric precision. The trees at the edge of the clearing leaned away, their branches twisted as if they'd been blown by a powerful wind, except the damage was uniform, circular, impossible. And in the centre, partially embedded in the soil, was a sphere. Chapter 2. The metallic sphere. None of us spoke for a long moment. We just stood at the edge of the clearing, staring. The sphere sat there like a piece of the moon had fallen to earth, like something that belonged in a museum or a laboratory, not in a clearing in the Wyoming wilderness. It was roughly 6 feet in diameter, perfectly smooth, made of something that looked like polished metal, but didn't quite behave like any metal I'd ever seen. The surface was mirror bright, reflecting the surrounding forest with crystal clarity. Sunlight bounced off it in ways that seemed wrong, creating patterns that shifted and moved even though the sphere itself was perfectly still. The reflection showed the trees, the sky, us standing there, frozen at the forest's edge, but there was something off about the reflection. It took me a moment to realise what it was. The reflection was delayed. When Deputy Torres took a step forward, his reflection followed a second or two behind, like the sphere was showing us the very recent past instead of the present moment. Like it was recording reality and playing it back with a lag. It was subtle enough that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. "What the hell is that?" Ramon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. I moved closer, my geology training kicking in despite my confusion. If this was a meteorite, and I was rapidly becoming certain it wasn't, then the impact site was all wrong. There should have been a crater, displaced soil, signs of violent contact with the ground. Instead, the sphere sat in a shallow depression, maybe a foot deep, as if it had simply pressed itself into the earth with patient insistence, rather than crashing into it with the force of orbital velocity. No one wanted to be the first to touch it. We stood in a circle, staring, each of us trying to process what we were looking at. There were no seams, no hatches, no markings of any kind. No scorch marks from atmospheric entry. No debris field. No fragments of material scattered around the impact site. Just this perfect, impossible sphere sitting in the dirt like it had always been there. Like it had grown from the earth itself. Sheriff Harding finally stepped forward, practical and decisive as always. Well, standing here staring won't tell us anything. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wrapped it around his palm, old cop instinct to avoid leaving fingerprints, and placed his hand against the surface. He jerked back immediately, eyes wide. "It's cold," he said. "Really cold." Patricia pulled out a portable thermometer from her pack, the kind she used in her classroom for chemistry demonstrations. She held it near the sphere's surface without touching it, waiting for the digital readout to stabilise. She frowned at the reading, then moved the thermometer to different spots around the sphere, checking, double-checking. 28 degrees, she said. "That's below freezing." "In June?" Ramon asked. "In direct sunlight," Patricia added, her voice distant, analytical. "That's impossible. Something this temperature should be warming up, absorbing heat from the environment. But look," she pointed at the thermometer. "It's maintaining a constant temperature. The reading isn't changing. It's like whatever this thing is made of is actively rejecting heat." Gregory moved around the sphere, examining it from different angles without touching. His engineer's eye catalogued details. "No visible power source, no exhaust, no radiation that I can detect." He pulled a small Geiger counter from his pocket. Watched the needle stay flat. "Whatever it's made of, it's not radioactive, at least not radioactive enough to register." I knelt down to examine where the sphere met the soil. The earth around it was frost-covered. Tiny ice crystals clinging to grass and roots, despite the warm summer air. The ground was hard, frozen solid in a ring about 3 feet wide. Beyond that ring, the soil was normal. Dark, soft, damp with morning dew, but inside that circle, winter had come and stayed. The sphere had sunk about 8 inches into the ground, but the soil beneath looked compressed, not displaced, as if the sphere had pushed the earth down rather than through, like pressing your thumb into clay. I pulled a knife from my pocket and tried to scrape some of the frozen soil. The blade skittered across the surface, barely making a mark. The ground was hard as concrete. That's when Bill reached out and touched it. Before any of us could stop him, before any of us could warn him about unknown materials and potential contamination, his hand was flat against the surface. He stood there for a long moment, his expression blank, and then he spoke very quietly. "It's vibrating," we all heard it then. Once Bill said it, once we knew to listen for it, we all felt it. A faint hum, barely perceptible at the edge of human hearing, felt more than heard. It was coming from the sphere, a low rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate in the chest, in the bones, in the hollow spaces behind your eyes. Not quite a sound, more like a sensation, a pressure that rose and fell with metronomic precision. Marcus pulled out his radio equipment. The signal we'd been hearing since the blackout was stronger here. Much stronger. He adjusted dials, fine-tuned frequencies, and played the signal through his portable speaker. The pattern matched. The rhythm matched. The pulse we were feeling from the sphere synchronized perfectly with the tones coming from the radio. "Whatever this thing is," Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly, "it's the source. This is what's been broadcasting. This is what killed the power. This is..." He stopped, looking at the sphere with something approaching awe. "This is transmitting, calling, like a beacon." Patricia suggested we take photographs and measurements, document everything, before we decided what to do next. She had a 35mm camera in her pack, professional quality, the kind serious hikers carried. Gregory had a tape measure and a notebook. I had my geology field journal and a collection bag for samples, though I wasn't sure what kind of sample I could possibly take from something this impossible. We spent the next 20 minutes recording every detail we could. Patricia circled the sphere, taking photographs from every angle. I sketched the clearing, measured the diameter of the flattened grass, took temperature readings from the frozen soil. Gregory measured the sphere itself, called out dimensions, noted the perfect smoothness of the surface. Marcus recorded the audio, capturing that steady pulse, that patient signal. The sphere sat there, cold and perfect and utterly alien, while we documented it like scientists examining a butterfly under glass. Like we had any idea what we were looking at, like our measurements and photographs and sketches could somehow make this make sense. That's when we lost time. Chapter 3. The Missing Time. One moment I was crouched next to the sphere, taking notes on the frost patterns in my field journal. I'd just written down the temperature gradient, how the frozen ring extended exactly 37 inches from the sphere's surface in all directions, and was starting to sketch the crystalline structure of the ice formations when everything shifted. The next moment, I was standing 15 feet away, near the edge of the clearing, my notebook on the ground behind me. My pen was in my hand, but the cap was on now. I didn't remember capping it. The sun had moved, a lot. The shadows were longer, stretching across the clearing, in directions they hadn't been before. My watch showed 27 minutes had passed. 27 minutes I had absolutely no memory of. I looked around wildly. Everyone else was scattered around the clearing, all of them looking equally confused. Patricia was holding her camera, staring at it like she'd never seen it before. The lens cap was on. She didn't remember putting it on. Marcus was on his knees, his radio equipment spread out around him, as if he'd been in the middle of packing it up. But he was just staring at the gear, his hands hovering over the dials, uncertain. Sheriff Harding and Ramon were standing together near the tree line, both looking pale. Gregory was sitting on a fallen log, his notebook open in his lap, but his expression was distant, confused. Bill was still the closest to the sphere, but he'd moved. He was sitting on the ground now, about 10 feet from where he'd been standing when I'd last seen him consciously. "Did we?" Ramon started, then stopped. His hand went to his service weapon, touched it, reassured himself it was still there. What just happened? "I don't know," Sheriff Harding said. His voice was steady but tight, controlled. "Everyone okay? Anyone hurt?" We did a quick check. No one was injured. No one was missing. But we were all disoriented, all trying to reconcile the fact that we'd apparently continued functioning for 27 minutes without any conscious awareness of what we were doing. "My camera," Patricia said. She was checking the frame counter on her Nikon. "I've taken 8 more photos. 8 photos I don't remember taking." Her hands were shaking slightly as she advanced the film, listening to the mechanical whir. What did I photograph? Bill was the only one still near the sphere. He was sitting on the ground, staring at his wrist. His sleeve was pushed up. There was a mark there, a perfect circle about the size of a quarter, red and raised like a brand, but without any sign of burning or blistering. The skin looked normal except for the colour and the perfect geometric precision of the circle. It looked almost like a stamp, like someone had pressed a seal into his flesh and left an imprint. "I don't remember getting this," Bill said quietly. He touched it gingerly, expecting pain, but his expression didn't change. "It doesn't hurt. Doesn't feel like anything really, but I definitely didn't have it before." We compared watches. All of them showed the same time. The sun's position confirmed it. 27 minutes, just gone, erased, like someone had cut that section of tape out of our lives and spliced the before and after together seamlessly. We'd been conscious during that time, we'd moved around, Patricia had taken photographs, Marcus had rearranged his equipment, but the memory of it was just gone. Gregory was the first to voice what we were all thinking. This isn't natural. This isn't any kind of meteorite or weather phenomenon or atmospheric anomaly. This is something else. Something that can affect human consciousness, human memory. "We need to leave," Sheriff Harding said. It wasn't a suggestion. "We need to leave right now and call this in to someone with more resources than us. This is beyond our capability." No one argued. Whatever the sphere was, it wasn't safe. It had done something to us, changed us, stolen time from us. We marked the location on our maps, took a final round of photographs from a distance. None of us wanted to get close to it again, and hiked back to town as quickly as we could. No one spoke much on the way back. We were all trying to process what had happened, or rather, what we couldn't remember happening. The forest was still quiet, still devoid of birds and insects, like everything with sense had fled from whatever that sphere represented. Only we had been foolish enough to approach it, to stand in its presence, to let it touch our minds. The walk back took 2 hours. 2 hours of uncomfortable silence broken only by the crunch of boots on dried leaves and the occasional snap of a branch. 2 hours of looking over our shoulders, feeling watched, feeling exposed. The forest felt different now, hostile, like we'd violated something, and the land itself knew it. When we got back to Devil's Hollow, the power was still out. But something else had changed. People were gathering in small groups, talking in hushed voices, looking at the sky with expressions of worry and fear. Something had happened while we were in the woods, something the whole town had experienced. The radios had changed. Chapter 4. The Whisper Frequency. Marcus spent that entire night analysing the recordings he'd made. Patricia joined him in his garage, along with Tom Chen, the high school physics teacher who had a background in signal processing from his graduate work at Colorado State. What they found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The signal wasn't random. Anyone could hear that much. But Tom, with his training in digital signal analysis and his collection of borrowed equipment from the high school science lab, discovered layers that the human ear couldn't distinguish. He'd brought a spectrum analyzer, the kind used to visualize sound waves, and when he ran Marcus's recordings through it, the pattern that emerged was extraordinary. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to the screen. The three of them, Marcus, Patricia, and Tom, huddled around the old CRT monitor in Marcus's garage, watching colourful cascades of data flow past. The signal has structure, mathematical structure. These tonal bursts follow patterns that resemble language syntax, pauses for emphasis, repetition for meaning, variation in pitch and duration that suggests information encoding. Patricia leaned closer, her chemistry teacher's mind adapting to physics concepts. "Are you saying this is a language, that something is speaking?" "Not speaking exactly," Tom said. He adjusted a dial, isolating different frequency bands. "But communicating, yes. More than that, when I run it through a Fourier transform, I find at least 3 distinct channels of data embedded in what sounds like a single transmission. Imagine someone speaking 3 different sentences simultaneously, each on a slightly different frequency, all perfectly synchronized." "Is that even possible?" Marcus asked. "It shouldn't be," Tom said. "The processing power required to generate and maintain this level of precision over multiple channels would be, well, it would be beyond anything we have, beyond anything I know about anyway. And look here." He pointed to a section of the waveform, where the pattern created tight spirals on the screen. Some of these patterns resemble coordinate mapping systems, longitude and latitude, azimuth and elevation, like it's describing locations, or maybe multiple locations, points in space. Could it be military? Sheriff Harding asked. He'd joined them around midnight, unable to sleep, drawn by the lights in Marcus's garage. Some kind of classified satellite communication? Maybe, Tom said. He didn't sound convinced. But I've consulted with military communications before. I did some contract work for the Air Force back in the 80s. This doesn't match any known protocol. The precision is beyond anything I've encountered. And if it's military, why would they choose Devil's Hollow as a broadcast centre? There's nothing strategic about our location. Unless we're not the intended recipients, Patricia said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. What if this signal isn't meant for us? What if it's calling to something else? Something out there? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Outside, the town of Devil's Hollow slept uneasily. The power still dead, cars still inoperable, and somewhere in the forest, that perfect sphere sat in its clearing, cold and patient and endlessly transmitting. That night, things got stranger. Animals started acting wrong. Dogs that normally barked at every passing car fell silent and refused to go outside, even for food. The Henderson family reported that their dog, Max, a normally boisterous golden retriever who had bound out the door at any opportunity, had spent the entire evening hiding under the bed, whimpering. When Jack Henderson tried to coax him out with treats, Max had just pressed himself deeper into the shadows, his eyes wide and frightened. Similar stories came from all over town. Cats wouldn't eat. Horses in the stables at the Hutchins ranch paced their stalls nervously, ears flat against their heads. Bill's cattle dog Ranger, who usually slept on the porch, had scratched at the back door until Bill let him inside, then immediately crawled under the kitchen table and refused to move. Birds disappeared. Not just a few, all of them. People started noticing it around sunset. The sky was empty. No crows gathering in their evening roosts, no sparrows chattering in the eaves, no hawks circling over the fields looking for mice. The telephone wires that normally sagged under the weight of dozens of birds were bare. The trees were silent, even the owls, which should have been starting their nightly hunts, were absent. And the cattle. Old man Peterson called it in around midnight, his voice shaking on the landline that had finally started working. All 73 head of cattle on his ranch were standing in the north pasture, perfectly still, all of them facing east, toward the forest, toward the sphere. They wouldn't move, wouldn't respond to calls or feed, just stood there, frozen, their eyes wide and unblinking, like statues of cattle rather than living animals. Sheriff Harding drove out to Peterson's ranch to see for himself. Ramon went with him. They stood at the fence in the darkness. The ranch's emergency generator had kicked in, providing some light, and watched 73 cattle stand motionless in perfect alignment. It was one of the most unsettling things either of them had ever seen. How long they've been like this, Harding asked. Since sundown, Peterson said. He was a tough old rancher who'd seen droughts and blizzards and every kind of cattle disease, but his voice was unsteady. Won't move, won't eat, won't drink. Just standing there, staring at nothing, or staring at something we can't see. I couldn't sleep that night. The humming I'd heard at the sphere kept echoing in my head, like a phantom sound that wouldn't fade. It wasn't in my ears, it was deeper than that, in my chest, in my bones. I sat on my porch, staring out at the dark forest, and I swear I could still hear it. Faint and distant, but there, pulsing, breathing, regular as a heartbeat. The mark on Bill's wrist had started to glow, just faintly, a soft blue-white luminescence that he'd noticed when he woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. The mark didn't hurt, didn't itch, didn't feel hot or cold. It just glowed. He'd gone to see the town physician, Old Leonard Marshall, who had practiced medicine in Devil's Hollow for 40 years and thought he'd seen everything. Leonard had no explanation for it. It wasn't a burn, it wasn't a rash, it wasn't a reaction to any known irritant or allergen. It was just there, like it had always been part of Bill's skin, pulsing gently with light that had no natural source. Patricia had noticed something too. When she developed the photographs from her camera, the 8 she didn't remember taking during the missing time, they showed the clearing from different angles, normal images, properly exposed and focused. But in 3 of them, there was something else. In the background, barely visible in the tree line, there was a shape, tall, indistinct, blurred as if the camera couldn't quite resolve it into clarity. It looked almost like a person, standing in the shadows, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin. And in each photograph, it was in a slightly different position, as if it had been circling the clearing while we stood there, unconscious of its presence, lost in our missing time. When Patricia showed these photographs to the group the next morning, spread out on Marcus's workbench under the harsh fluorescent light, no one spoke for a long moment. We just stared at that blurred figure, trying to understand what we were looking at. "Was that there?" Ramon asked quietly. "Was that thing watching us?" "I don't remember seeing anything," Patricia said. "But then again, I don't remember taking these photos. None of us remember anything from those 27 minutes. "What if it wasn't there physically?" Tom suggested. "What if the camera picked up something that exists on a different frequency? Something our eyes can't normally see?" It was a comforting thought, slightly less terrifying than the alternative, that something had been standing in those trees, watching us, while we stood frozen and compliant, stripped of our conscious awareness and our memories. Chapter 5. The First Contact Event. 3 days after the blackout started, the power came back. It happened at exactly 3 in the morning. Every light in Devil's Hollow blazed to life simultaneously. Bedroom lamps, street lights, the neon, sign at the gas station, the exit signs at the diner. Everything, all at once, as if someone had thrown a master switch somewhere. Car engines that had been dead roared to life in driveways, their sudden noise shattering the nighttime silence. People woke up thinking their house was on fire, thinking something catastrophic had happened, stumbling out of bed to find every appliance on, every light burning bright, the TV blaring static, because no one had turned it off when the power failed 3 days ago. The suddenness was shocking. After 3 days of darkness and silence, the return of electricity felt aggressive, violent. I woke up to my radio alarm blasting at full volume. I'd left it on maximum, trying to hear the signal better. My desk lamp burned my eyes. The overhead light in my room blazed like a small sun. It took me a full minute to orient myself, to turn things off, to restore some semblance of darkness and quiet. By dawn, everything felt normal again. Cars ran smoothly. Phones worked. The radio signal was gone, replaced by normal stations broadcasting normal programs. Morning DJs making jokes, news reports about the weather and sports scores. The emergency broadcast system running tests. Everything mundane, everything ordinary. The signal that had dominated every frequency for 3 days had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. It was as if the entire event had been a strange shared dream, except we all knew better. We'd seen the sphere, we'd lost time. Bill still had the mark on his wrist, glowing faintly even in daylight. Patricia's photographs showed that blurred figure in the trees. Marcus still had his recordings, hours of that mathematical pattern repeating endlessly. But the relief in town was palpable. Power meant refrigerators worked again. Food wouldn't spoil. The pharmacy could keep medications refrigerated. The gas station pumps would function. Life could return to normal. People wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had happened was finished, that we could move on and forget about the strange 3 days when Devil's Hollow had been cut off from the world. But the people who'd been to the clearing knew better. We knew this wasn't over. The sphere was still out there, still cold, still humming with that patient frequency. And something had changed, something had opened. A door we didn't know existed had been unlocked, and we had no idea what might come through. It started with shadows. Small things at first, movements in peripheral vision that disappeared when you turned to look directly at them. Flickers at the edge of awareness, the kind of thing you could dismiss as tiredness, as stress, as imagination. Mrs. Yamoto, who ran the town library, was one of the first to report something specific. She lived in a small house behind the library building, a neat little property with a well-tended garden and a view of the forest. 3 nights in a row she saw an orange glow between the trees behind her. House, always in the same spot, always around midnight, always lasting for exactly 5 minutes before fading away. The glow had texture to it, she said, movement, like firelight, but the wrong colour, too bright, too pure, nothing like a campfire or a flashlight. She'd called Sheriff Harding the first night. By the time he arrived, the glow was gone. The second night, she called again. This time Harding got there, while the glow was still visible. He saw it himself, a pulsing orange light deep in the trees, maybe half a mile into the forest. They tried to investigate, driving up the old fire road, hiking in on foot. But by the time they reached the approximate location, there was nothing there. No burn marks, no equipment, no explanation, just dark forest and the smell of pine and the sensation of being watched. Tommy Brennan, a teenager who worked at the gas station, swore he saw a figure standing in the reflection of the station window one evening. He was inside working the register during the late shift when he glanced up and saw it in the glass. Tall, very tall, too thin to be human. Standing just outside the station, perfectly still. But when he spun around to look directly at where the figure should have been, there was nothing there. Just empty concrete there and the gas pumps and the highway beyond. He told his manager, who told him to stop watching scary movies before work. But Tommy knew what he'd seen. The figure had been real, or as real as anything reflected in glass could be. It had been looking at him. He was certain of that. He could feel the weight of its attention, even through the reflection. Similar stories multiplied across town. A shape in the window that wasn't there when you looked outside. Footsteps on the porch with no one there. The sensation of being watched when you were alone. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. Nothing dramatic, nothing overtly threatening. Just wrong. A persistent wrongness that settled over Devil's Hollow like fog, obscuring the familiar and replacing it with something alien. Then I saw it. I was in my bedroom late one evening, reading a geology textbook in a futile attempt to keep up with summer coursework. My desk faced away from the window, but the window's reflection was visible in the glass covering a poster on my wall, a map of Montana's geological features. I was taking notes when I saw movement in that reflected window, a shape, indistinct and dark, moving across the reflected image of my room. Not outside the window, that would have made sense, this was inside. In the reflection I could see my bed, my bookshelf, my closet door, and moving between them, a tall figure that shouldn't exist. It moved smoothly, gliding rather than walking, crossing from one side of the reflected room to the other. I turned, heart racing, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing. Just my empty bedroom. Just the bookshelf and the bed and the closet door, all exactly as they should be. I looked back at the reflected window. The shape was gone. The reflection showed only my normal room, empty except for me. I sat there for a long time, heart hammering, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Trick of the light, fatigue, stress from the events of the past week. But I didn't believe any of those explanations. Something had been there. Not physically present maybe, but there nonetheless. Existing in some space adjacent to ours, visible only in reflections, in peripheral vision, in the gaps between what we expect to see and what's actually there, and the humming, that low rhythmic pulse. I wasn't the only one hearing it anymore. A dozen people reported the same thing over the next few days. A steady vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, always at night, always when they were alone, always the same pattern as the radio signal we'd recorded. Some people heard it in their homes, others only outside. A few, like me, felt it more than heard it. A pressure in the chest, a resonance in the bones. Patricia suggested we go back to the sphere, see if it had changed, see if there was a connection between the returned power and these strange sightings. Sheriff Harding agreed, but this time he insisted we bring more people and better equipment. We organised a second expedition, scheduled for the following morning. More witnesses, more documentation, maybe, hopefully, more answers. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. The humming was louder than ever, resonating through my skull like a living thing. I stood on my porch in the darkness, staring at the dark tree line to the east, and I knew somehow that something was waiting for me out there. Not waiting to harm me, not waiting to threaten, just waiting, expectant, patient, like it had been waiting for a very long time, and had all the time in the world to wait longer. The mark on my palm, I'd noticed it that afternoon, appearing like a shadow under my skin before rising to the surface as a perfect circle, identical to Bill's, was warm. Not painfully so, but noticeably. Like I was holding something hot, like something inside me was generating heat. And in that warmth was a compulsion, a pull, an invitation I didn't understand, but felt in every fibre of my being. I should have waited for the expedition, should have waited for morning and backup and witnesses, but the pull was too strong. At dusk I found myself walking east, toward the forest, following a compulsion I didn't fully understand and couldn't resist. The humming guided me, growing stronger with each step, building in intensity until it wasn't just a sound or a feeling but something fundamental, as if the world itself was vibrating at a frequency that only I could perceive, as if I was being tuned to match something vast and patient and utterly alien. Chapter 6. The Being in the Field. I didn't go to the clearing with the sphere. The pull led me elsewhere. Instead, I found myself walking toward the Hutchins wheat field, a vast expanse of golden grain that bordered the forest on the eastern edge of Bill's property. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and crimson, turning the wheat into a sea of molten gold that rippled in the evening breeze. The field was beautiful. I'd seen it 1,000 times growing up, but tonight it looked different, more vivid, more real. Like I was seeing it for the first time with eyes that actually worked. Every detail stood out with crystalline clarity. Each individual stalk of wheat, the way the light caught the grain heads, the patterns the wind made as it moved through the crops. It was overwhelming. That's when I saw it, standing in the middle of the field, maybe 200 feet away, perfectly still among the moving wheat. Something that shouldn't exist, something that couldn't exist. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 or 9 feet if it was standing on the ground. The basic shape suggested humanoid proportions, but wrong. The limbs were too long, too thin, jointed in ways that didn't match human anatomy. The torso was elongated, stretched, with a grace that seemed almost boneless, and the way it stood, perfectly motionless, while the wheat moved around it, suggested a patience that felt profoundly alien. But here's what I'll never forget, what I can't adequately describe, even now, years later. I couldn't see it clearly. My eyes wouldn't focus on it. It was like trying to look at something through water, the image constantly shifting and blurring. Light bent around it, creating a haze effect that made it seem partially translucent. I could see the wheat behind it, through it, around it, all at once, as if it existed slightly out of phase with reality, occupying a space that was here but also elsewhere. The ground around it vibrated. I could feel it through my boots, through the bones of my feet, travelling up my legs and into my spine. The same humming, the same pulse coming from the earth itself. The wheat stalks near the figure bent away from it in a perfect circle, creating a zone of flattened grain about 10 feet in diameter, not pressed down by weight, but pushed away by something invisible, by presence, by intention. The creature, and I knew it was a creature, not a trick of light or a hallucination or anything my mind might have constructed, didn't move. It just stood there in the centre of that circle of bent wheat watching me, or at least I felt like it was watching me. I couldn't see eyes or a face or any features at all through the distortion. Just that tall, blurred shape that my brain refused to properly process. Every time I tried to focus on it, my vision slid away, like trying to look directly at your own blind spot. I stood frozen, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, every instinct screaming at me to run, to turn around and flee back to town, back to safety, back to the world I understood. Fear flooded through me, primal and overwhelming. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. That being shouldn't exist. The fact that it was standing there, silent and patient, violated every understanding I had of the world. But beneath the fear was something else. Curiosity, wonder. The sense that this thing, this impossible being, was waiting for me to understand something. That it had been waiting for days, maybe longer. That its presence here, in this field, at this exact moment, was deliberate, intentional, meaningful. The sun continued its descent. The light shifted from gold to deep orange to purple. The wheat turned from amber to shadow. And still we stood there, me and this thing from somewhere else, separated by 200 feet of darkening field, connected by something I didn't have words for. Time felt elastic, unreliable. I might have stood there for minutes or hours, I couldn't tell. The world had narrowed to just me and the being and the vibrating earth beneath our feet. Then, without any warning, without any movement, I could perceive it spoke, not in words, not in sounds, in concepts, in meanings that appeared directly in my mind, bypassing language entirely. Waiting. That was the first concept, a sense of vast patience, of time measured in scales I couldn't comprehend, of watching and waiting for something specific. Recognition. The second concept came with a flood of emotion that wasn't mine. Relief, something like joy, the sense of finally being seen after a long blindness, of connection after isolation. Home. The third concept came with images, not visual images, but something deeper. Impressions of a place I'd never seen but somehow understood. A world where light behaved differently, where distance was optional, where consciousness was the only geography that mattered. And then, as suddenly as the connection opened, it closed. The being was gone, simply not there anymore. No fade, no movement. One moment it existed, the next moment the space it had occupied was just empty field. The wheat sprang back up, releasing from whatever force had held it down. The vibration stopped. The humming faded to a whisper. I stood there, gasping, as if I'd been holding my breath for a long time. My legs felt weak, my vision swam, and I realised I was crying, tears running down my face, though I couldn't have said why. Not from fear, not from joy, just from the overwhelming intensity of whatever had just happened. I ran, I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran back to town, stumbling through the twilight, gasping, my mind racing. I'd made contact, actual contact, not with a sphere or a signal or a distant presence, but with something alive, something conscious, something that had reached across the vast gulf between its existence and mine and touched my mind with gentle, patient intention. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Not yet. I wasn't sure I could explain it. Wasn't sure I believed it myself. I went home, locked my door, and sat in my dark bedroom, trembling. The mark on my palm was glowing now, bright enough to read by, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. And in my mind, echoing like a memory of someone else's voice, those three concepts kept repeating. Waiting, recognition, home. Chapter 7. The message. That night I dreamed, but calling it a dream feels inadequate. It was too vivid, too structured, too intentional, like someone else's memory being played in my head, like a message being delivered through the only channel my mind could receive. I was standing in water, not drowning, just standing, the liquid reaching my waist. But it wasn't water, it was thicker, more viscous, with a weight that water didn't have. And it glowed, a soft phosphorescence that lit the space around me from within. I could see my legs beneath the surface, distorted but visible, surrounded by gentle currents that moved without wind. I looked up and saw a sky that wasn't a sky, swirling clouds of colour that moved with mathematical precision, creating patterns that hurt to look at but were impossibly beautiful. Fractals that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive, geometric shapes that folded in on themselves in ways that violated Euclidean space, colours that didn't have names, that my brain interpreted as something between sound and light and texture. The clouds moved in rhythm with the humming. I could hear it here, louder than ever, but it didn't hurt. Instead, it felt like music, like the fundamental frequency of existence itself, like the sound that holds reality together at its seams. Then the perspective shifted. I was moving through space, not floating, not flying, but simply moving, as if distance was optional, as if the space between one place and another was a choice rather than a barrier. I saw star maps spread out before me, like a navigation chart, constellations I didn't recognize, binary stars orbiting each other in tight spirals, nebulae forming new suns in clouds of dust and gas. Planets appeared, one by one, like images being shuffled through my mind. A world with rings of ice and dust that caught the light of a distant sun. A moon covered in cracks, frozen water welling up from below to create temporary oceans before freezing again. A gas giant with storms that had raged for millennia, large enough to swallow Earth whole. And everywhere, that same rhythmic pulse, the breathing hum that had followed me since the blackout. But here in this dream or vision, or whatever it was, I could hear variations. Harmonics, as if the signal I'd been hearing was just one voice in a vast choir, all singing different parts of the same endless song. The scene changed again. I was in a corridor, metal walls, smooth and seamless like the sphere, stretching endlessly in both directions. But these walls were alive with light. Patterns moved across them in waves like neural impulses, like thoughts made visible. The walls reflected not the present, but possibilities, potential futures branching out in infinite directions. In one reflection, I saw myself walking, but I was decades older, my hair grey, my face lined with age. In another, I was a child, young and innocent, untouched by what was to come. In a third, I was someone else entirely. Different features, different body, same consciousness, looking out through different eyes. The reflections multiplied, showing me versions of myself that might have been, could have been, would be, in timelines I couldn't navigate. At the end of the corridor was a door, and beyond the door, I somehow knew, was an answer. Not the answer to a specific question, but the answer. The fundamental truth that made everything else make sense, the key that unlocked all mysteries. I walked forward, drawn by certainty that had no rational basis. The humming grew louder, more insistent, building to a crescendo that felt like pressure behind my eyes. I reached the door, or maybe the door reached me. Space folded, and suddenly I was standing before it. But it wasn't a door. It was the sphere, but massive now, planet-sized, hanging in empty space against a backdrop of stars. And as I watched, unable to look away, it began to split open like an iris, revealing an interior that swallowed light. The opening expanded, showing me darkness so complete it felt alive, an emptiness so profound it had presence, like staring into the void between galaxies, but knowing that the void was staring back with ancient, patient awareness. Then I saw it, the planet, hanging in the darkness revealed by the sphere's opening, a world I'd never seen, but somehow recognized, covered in structures that looked like mirrors, vast crystalline formations that reflected the light of 3 suns in blinding cascades. Cities that were more like geometric concepts than buildings, architecture that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And I understood, in that dreamlike way you sometimes understand things without words, that this was a home, someone's home, a place where consciousness didn't need bodies the way we do, where thought was matter, and matter was optional, where beings could exist as pure awareness, taking form only when necessary, when interacting with species that still believed in the primacy of flesh. The planet's surface showed me more. I saw beings moving between the mirror cities, tall, graceful, their forms shifting based on context, on need, on intention. Sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, sometimes just light given temporary shape, and among them I saw the being from the wheat field. Home, whole, where it belonged. The understanding hit me like a physical force. The sphere wasn't a spacecraft, it was an escape pod, an emergency beacon, something used only in crisis. The being I'd seen had crashed here, had been stranded, separated from its home, from its people, from the fundamental reality it knew. And it had been calling, broadcasting, waiting for rescue from a civilization that existed light years away. The dream ended with an image seared into my brain. The sphere opening, revealing not emptiness but purpose. And inside, waiting with infinite patience, the tall figure from the field, waiting to return, waiting to go home, waiting for someone to understand. I woke up screaming. My sheets were soaked with sweat, tangled around my legs. The taste of copper filled my mouth. My nose was bleeding, thin streams running down over my lips, dripping onto my pillow. I fumbled for my bedside lamp, knocking over a water glass, finally finding the switch. The light revealed my room, normal and familiar. But I didn't feel normal. I felt changed, opened, like something had been written into my consciousness that I'd never be able to erase. I stumbled to the bathroom, turned on the light, looked in the mirror. My reflection looked back, pale and shaken, but my eyes looked different, more aware, more present, like I'd woken up from a lifelong dream into a wider reality. And then I saw it. I looked down at my hand, turning it over in the harsh fluorescent light. There, pressed into my palm like a stamp, was the mark. A perfect circle, red and raised, identical to the one on Bill's wrist, but mine was glowing brighter, pulsing with lights that seemed to come from beneath the skin. It didn't hurt. It felt warm, and deep in my mind, beneath the panic and confusion, beneath the overwhelming weight of what I'd just experienced, I knew the truth. The encounter in the field hadn't been physical, it had been mental. The being had touched my mind, not my body, had shown me what I needed to see, had given me understanding that transcended language. And this mark was proof, evidence of contact, a sign that something vast and patient and profoundly alien had reached across the incomprehensible distance between its existence and mine, and said in the only way it could, "I see you. I recognize you. You understand." I spent the rest of the night sitting at my desk, writing everything down in my field journal. Every detail of the dream, every concept, every image, every sensation. My hand cramped from writing, but I couldn't stop. I needed to record it all before the memory faded, before my rational mind could dismiss it as just a dream, before I could convince myself it hadn't really happened. Dawn came slowly. Grey light crept through my window, painting my room in shades of uncertainty, and when the sun finally rose, bright and ordinary, I was still writing, still trying to capture the impossible, still marked by something I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't stood in that wheat field and felt their mind touched by consciousness from another world. Chapter 8. The Sphere Awakens. By morning, the entire town knew something was happening. More people had the marks now. Bill still had his on the wrist, now glowing steadily, like a nightlight. I had mine on the palm, pulsing with my heartbeat. Patricia woke up with one on her ankle. She called me right away, her voice tight with controlled fear. Marcus had one behind his ear, discovered when he was shaving. Gregory found his on the inside of his forearm. All of us who'd been part of the original search party. All of us who'd lost time near the sphere. All of us marked, branded, changed by proximity to something we couldn't comprehend. But the sphere itself was changing too. Tom Chen, cautious and methodical, had set up a remote observation post at the clearing days ago. A weatherproof camera on a tripod, connected to a timer and a large battery pack, taking photographs every hour. Automated documentation, safe distance, no more lost time or mysterious marks. When we reviewed the images on the morning after my dream, we saw the progression. The sphere was evolving, awakening, coming alive in ways that made our initial discovery look dormant by comparison. The sphere was glowing. The first photographs, taken 3 days ago, showed nothing unusual, just the cold metallic surface reflecting the forest. But as the days progressed, the images showed change. A faint blue light emanating from within the metal, barely visible at first, then growing stronger, hour by hour, frame by frame. The glow intensifying until the latest images showed a sphere blazing with cold fire, bright enough to cast shadows in the clearing, even at noon. And the ground around it was changing. The frost had spread in a perfect circle, now extending 20 feet in all directions from the sphere's centre. But it wasn't just frost anymore. The soil was crystallizing, forming geometric patterns that looked almost like circuitry, like a vast microprocessor spreading out from the sphere as its core. The patterns were fractal, repeating at different scales, creating a network of crystalline pathways that extended deeper into the earth with each passing hour. Tom had also set up microphones, recording the ambient sound. The audio files showed the vibration growing stronger, more complex. What had been a simple rhythmic pulse had evolved into something layered, multiple frequencies overlapping, creating harmonics that shouldn't be possible from a single source. It was as if the sphere was learning to speak more clearly, fine-tuning its transmission, preparing for something. And the vibration was stronger. You could hear it now, without any equipment, a steady, rhythmic hum that echoed through the forest, that made tree branches tremble, that caused the surface of Copper Lake to ripple in concentric circles despite the absence of wind. Animals had stopped entering the area entirely. The birds were still gone. Even insects avoided the clearing, creating a zone of silence around the sphere that expanded with each passing day. Sheriff Harding wanted to call in the state police, maybe even the federal authorities. This was beyond us, beyond the capability of a small-town sheriff's department. We needed experts, scientists, military, someone who might actually understand what we were dealing with, but Marcus convinced him to wait. Just one more day. We needed to understand what was happening before the government got involved, because once they did, we'd never see or hear about any of this again. It would be classified, buried, forgotten. The truth would be locked away in some underground facility, and we'd be left with official explanations that satisfied no one. Whatever this is, Marcus said, standing in Harding's office with the rest of us, it's trying to communicate. The signal, the marks, the visions some of us have had, it's reaching out. And if we bring in the feds now, they'll shut it down, contain it. We might never know what it was trying to say. Harding didn't like it. You could see the conflict on his face, but he was also a man who'd lived in Devil's Hollow his entire life, who'd seen strange things in these mountains, who understood that some mysteries deserved answers before they were locked away forever. 24 hours, he said finally. One day. Then I'm making calls. That night, Bill collapsed. He was at home, sitting down to dinner with his wife Sarah, when he simply fell forward, unconscious, his face barely missing his plate. Sarah screamed, caught him before he hit the floor, called for an ambulance that couldn't possibly arrive in time. The mark on his wrist was glowing bright blue, brighter than it had ever been, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The light was strong enough to see through his skin, illuminating the bones of his arm like an X-ray, showing the network of veins and arteries carrying marked blood through his body. Sarah's next-door neighbour, a retired nurse named Helen Foster, came running at the sound of the screams. Together, they got Bill onto the floor, checked his breathing, his pulse. Both were steady. He wasn't dying, he was just absent, like his mind had gone somewhere else while his body waited for it to return. Leonard Marshall arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, moving with the quick efficiency of a man who'd handled countless emergencies over 4 decades of small-town practice. He examined Bill, checked his vitals, shone a light in his unresponsive eyes. Physically, he's fine, Leonard said, confusion evident in his voice. Heart rate normal, breathing normal, no signs of stroke or seizure. He's just not here. It's like he's sleeping, but I can't wake him. Bill regained consciousness 30 minutes later, gasping, his eyes flying open. The mark on his wrist had faded back to its usual dim glow. He looked around confused, trying to orient himself. I heard it, he said, his voice hoarse. I heard a voice, not in my ears, in my head. We all leaned closer. Sarah gripped his hand. Leonard listened with the careful attention of a physician cataloguing symptoms he didn't understand. What did it say? Harding asked. Bill closed his eyes, trying to recapture the memory. It was a single word repeated, over and over, but it wasn't in English, wasn't in any language I recognise, but I knew what it meant. I understood it. What did it mean? Patricia asked softly. Bill opened his eyes, looked at each of us in turn. His expression was strange, fear mixed with wonder, confusion mixed with certainty. Return. Chapter 9. The Departure. We went back to the clearing at dawn, All of us. The whole town, or near enough. Word had spread through Devil's Hollow like wildfire. People needed to see, needed to witness, needed to be part of whatever was about to happen. Because everyone knew, could feel, that something was building toward a conclusion. The forest was silent as we hiked in. More than 100 people moving through the trees, trying to be quiet, trying not to disturb whatever waited ahead. Families with children, elderly residents who hadn't hiked in years but refused to miss this, teenagers with cameras, the pastor, the mayor, everyone who could walk the trail, everyone who needed to see the impossible with their own eyes. The sphere was fully luminous when we reached the clearing, glowing bright blue like a small star brought to earth, casting sharp shadows across the crystalline patterns that had spread through the soil. The frost-covered trees surrounding the clearing sparkled in the early morning light, each branch encased in ice, despite the warmth of late June. The entire scene looked like something from another world, a place where different rules applied. We stood in a wide circle around the clearing, maybe 100 people, watching and waiting. No one spoke. What was there to say? We'd come to witness something beyond explanation, beyond categorization. We'd come because the alternative, staying home, pretending this wasn't happening, was impossible. The humming was everywhere now, resonating in our chests, our bones, our teeth, strong enough to feel in the soles of our feet, building, intensifying, like the earth itself was vibrating at a frequency that reality wasn't quite designed to handle. Then the sphere began to unfold. There's no better word for it. The surface, which had been seamless and solid for days, began to split along lines that hadn't existed moments before. Panels shifted and reconfigured, moving with liquid grace, making absolutely no sound. It was like watching origami in reverse, a complex shape unpacking itself into something simpler and more profound. The panels moved in ways that shouldn't be physically possible, folding through angles that hurt to look at, creating geometry that violated three-dimensional space. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, like watching reality itself rearrange its fundamental rules. The interior was revealed gradually, panel by panel, as if the sphere was being patient with us, giving our minds time to adjust to each new impossibility before presenting the next. The chamber inside was hollow, perfectly smooth, lined with the same mirror-like material as the exterior, but this interior absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Looking into it was like looking into the void of space itself, into the gaps between stars where light hasn't reached in billions of years. No machinery, no controls, no technology that we could recognize, just empty space that somehow felt occupied. That had weight and presence despite containing nothing our eyes could see, like a room that was somehow also a door, a container that was also a passage. And then we saw it, the being from the field. It materialized at the edge of the clearing, near the tree line where the frost patterns ended and normal forest began. But this time, there was no blurring, no distortion. We could see it clearly. All of us, 100 witnesses to something that shouldn't exist. It was tall. We'd known that, but seeing it clearly made the scale apparent. At least 9 feet, maybe more. Humanoid in the most basic sense. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head. But the proportions were wrong in ways that created a disturbing grace. The skin, if it was skin, was smooth and pale, with a faint opalescent quality that caught the light strangely, creating subtle rainbow patterns that shifted with each movement. The head was larger than it should be, the skull elongated, suggesting a brain cavity that could contain thoughts we'd never comprehend. The features were minimal, suggestions of eyes dark and depthless, and a mouth but nothing defined. Nothing quite human despite the overall humanoid structure. The limbs were elongated, elegant, in a way that seemed almost fragile but suggested strength we couldn't estimate. It moved toward the sphere with smooth gliding steps. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustle of displaced air, just silence and that ever-present hum that seemed to emanate from the being itself as much as from the sphere. When it moved, space seemed to accommodate it rather than be pushed aside by it, as if reality was making room for something that existed on its own terms. It walked across the clearing, stepping carefully over the crystalline patterns in the frozen soil. Its movements were unhurried, patient, as if it had all the time in the world, or knew that time was irrelevant to what was about to happen. When it reached the sphere, it turned to face us, all of us. Its gaze swept across the crowd, and I swear it paused on me, on Bill, on Patricia and Marcus, on everyone who carried the marks, acknowledging us, recognizing us, thanking us perhaps, in the only way it could. Then it extended one arm. The hand, if you could call it that, had too many fingers, long and delicate, jointed in ways that didn't match human anatomy, and placed it against the opening of the sphere. The glow intensified, becoming almost blinding, and in that moment I understood. We all understood. The knowledge wasn't in words, it was just suddenly present in our minds, placed there by the being with gentle, patient intention. The sphere wasn't a craft in the way we think of crafts. It wasn't transportation, it was a rescue pod, an emergency beacon. This being, whatever it was, wherever it came from, had crashed here, had been stranded, separated from its home, from its people, from everything it knew, and it had been waiting, calling out, hoping for retrieval, for rescue from a civilization that existed light years away. And now finally they were coming. The opening sphere wasn't launching, it was receiving, creating a doorway, a passage, a way home that bypassed the tyranny of distance and time. The being stepped into the sphere. The opening began to close, those impossible panels shifting back into place, sealing with perfect precision. The glow reached a crescendo, pulsing once, twice, 3 times, each pulse sending out waves of pressure that we felt in our chests, that made the air shimmer, that caused the frozen trees to shake and drop fragments of ice that caught the morning light like falling stars. The humming became a single, sustained note that vibrated through everything, through the earth, through our bodies, through the air itself. A fundamental frequency that felt like the sound of the universe taking a deep breath. Then in complete silence, the sphere rose. It lifted straight up, slowly at first, with deliberate grace, no exhaust, no thrust, no jets of fire or clouds of smoke. It simply ascended, defying gravity with the same patient insistence it had shown since arriving. Rising above the trees, above the clearing, climbing into the morning sky that was brightening from grey to blue, we all watched, heads tilted back, shielding our eyes from the blue light that grew more intense as the sphere rose higher. Some people were crying, some were praying, some just watched in stunned silence, trying to imprint every detail in their memories, knowing they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to explain this moment to people who would never believe them. The sphere climbed faster now, accelerating smoothly, leaving behind a trail of distorted air that bent the light passing through it, higher and higher until it was just a point of light against the morning sky, indistinguishable from the stars that were fading with the dawn. And then it was gone. Just gone. No flash, no explosion, no sound. It simply stopped being there, as if it had stepped through a door in space and closed the door behind it. The silence afterward was profound. We stood there, 100 people, in a frozen clearing, trying to process what we'd just witnessed, trying to understand what it meant, trying to accept that we'd just watched someone go home, back to a place we could barely imagine, in a way that rewrote everything we thought we knew about the universe. In the clearing, all that remained was a perfect circle of scorched earth, still glowing faintly with a residual heat. The crystalline patterns had melted, leaving behind glass-like formations that reflected the morning light in rainbow cascades. The frozen trees were already beginning to thaw, water dripping from branches like tears. The sphere was gone, the being was gone, but the evidence remained, burned into the earth and into our memories. We stood there for a long time. No one wanted to be the first to leave. No one wanted to walk away from this place, where the impossible had become real, where we'd witnessed something that would define the rest of our lives. Eventually, slowly, people began to drift back toward town, speaking in hushed voices, holding hands, processing, grieving in a strange way, for the end of an encounter we'd barely begun to understand. Chapter 10. The government arrives. They came within hours, black SUVs with government plates, unmarked trucks with serious-looking people in suits who didn't introduce themselves or show credentials. They moved through Devil's Hollow with military precision, polite but firm, asking questions and confiscating evidence. I was in my room when they came for me. 2 men in dark suits and sunglasses, the kind of men who looked like they'd stepped out of a Cold War spy novel. They knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. Professional, thorough, intimidating in a way that was clearly intentional. "Alex Rivers?" the taller one asked, though it wasn't really a question. He already knew who I was. "We need you to come with us. Just a few questions about recent events." They interviewed me in a makeshift command centre they'd set up in the high school gymnasium. Long tables covered with equipment, computers, recording devices, a dozen people working with focused intensity. They separated us, the search party members, made sure we couldn't coordinate stories, standard interrogation technique. The interview was polite, professional, but there was steel underneath the courtesy. They asked about the sphere, the clearing, the missing time, the marks on our skin. They photographed my palm, taking dozens of images of the circular mark from different angles, with different lighting. They took blood samples, skin samples, asked me to describe everything I'd experienced, then asked me to describe it again, looking for inconsistencies. Every photograph we'd taken was collected, every tape recording, every note. Tom's observation equipment was seized, loaded into trucks with remarkable efficiency. Patricia's camera was taken, film and all. Marcus's radio recordings disappeared into black cases with classified labels. They went through our homes with polite determination, removing anything that could serve as evidence. The official statement came 2 days later, released through the sheriff's office, but clearly written by someone in Washington. A weather satellite had malfunctioned, fell from orbit. The debris field had been contained and removed. The electrical interference was a result of the satellite's power core, experimental technology that had unexpectedly created localized electromagnetic effects. Everything was under control, nothing to worry about. Please remain calm and go about your normal lives. The statement explained everything and explained nothing. Weather satellites didn't create perfect spheres, didn't generate mathematical patterns on every radio frequency, didn't leave marks on people's skin, didn't ascend back into space in complete silence. But the statement was confident and authoritative, full of technical jargon that sounded plausible to anyone who hadn't been there. Sheriff Harding stood on the steps of the town hall and read the statement in a flat, tired voice. A crowd had gathered, maybe 300 people, all the witnesses and their families, and anyone else in town who'd heard the stories. When Harding finished, he looked out at the assembled crowd. His jaw tightened. Then he said something off script, something that probably got him in trouble with the men in dark suits. "You all know what you saw. Don't let anyone tell you different." Then he folded the statement, put it in his pocket, and went back inside. The men in suits followed him, their expressions unreadable behind their sunglasses. The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking in low voices, sharing looks that said, "We all know the truth, even if we're not supposed to say it." We all went home. What else could we do? The government had spoken. The truth had been decided. Official reality had been established, and we were just people in a small town who'd witnessed something that officially never happened. We had our memories, we had our marks, we had each other, but we had no proof, no evidence, no way to make anyone believe us, except we knew we remembered. And the marks never faded. Epilogue. 20 years later. 20 years. That's how long it's been since the night everything went silent. Devil's Hollow hasn't changed much. Still the same population, give or take a few families who moved away and a few who moved in. Still the same quiet streets and dark forests. Still the same mountains standing watch over the valley. But the people here carry a secret, a shared knowledge that bonds us in ways that outsiders can't understand. I still live here. Never finished my geology degree. Didn't see the point somehow. After you've seen proof that reality is larger and stranger than any textbook can capture. After you've had your mind touched by consciousness from another world, studying rock formations seems small, limited. I came back from college after that summer and never left again. I run the hardware store now. Took it over when the previous owner retired. It's a quiet life, simple. I sell nails and hammers and paint. I help people fix their plumbing. I give advice on home repairs. It's honest work, grounding, real, and it keeps me in Devil's Hollow, in the place where everything changed. But the mark on my palm never faded. It's still there, a faint circle that most people probably wouldn't notice unless I pointed it out. Bill still has his on, the wrist. Patricia's is still visible on her ankle. Marcus's is behind his ear, hidden by his hair. Gregory passed away 5 years ago. A stroke, sudden and fatal. But I saw his mark at the funeral. Still visible on his forearm, even in death. Permanent, indelible. Proof of contact that outlasted the man who carried it. We don't talk about it much. Don't need to. We know. We see each other around town, share a look, a nod, an understanding that needs no words. We're the marked ones, the witnesses, the people who stood in that clearing and watched someone go home. The mark does something strange. It pulses, just faintly, a warmth that comes and goes. I've noticed it happens before storms, big weather systems rolling in from the west. The mark warms up about 6 hours before the first clouds arrive. It's uncanny, reliable, better than any weather report. Patricia says hers does the same thing. We've never found an explanation. Leonard Marshall studied it before he retired, took dozens of tests, found nothing unusual about the tissue itself. But the mark remains, and it pulses, and it knows when storms are coming with perfect accuracy. And the signal. Every few years, Marcus picks it up again on his ham radio, just for a few seconds. That same rhythmic pattern, those same tonal bursts. It appears without warning, floods every frequency, and then disappears just as quickly. Never long enough to record properly, never long enough to analyse. Just a brief greeting from something vast and distant, a reminder that we're remembered. The last time was 3 months ago, middle of the night. I woke up from a sound sleep, my mark pulsing warm against my palm. The phone was ringing, Marcus calling me immediately, his voice shaking with excitement. "It's back," he said, "just for 10 seconds. But it was there, the same pattern, exactly the same. I drove to his garage. We sat there together, headphones on, listening to the recording he'd managed to capture. 10 seconds of that mathematical precision, that patient signal. 10 seconds of contact with something that existed light years away, but still somehow remembered a small town in Wyoming where they'd found help. We don't know what it means, don't know if it's a message, a greeting, a warning, or just cosmic noise that happens to sound meaningful to people who want to believe. But we choose to believe it means something. That out there, somewhere among the stars, something remembers us. Something that once needed help and found it in a place that nobody's ever heard of. The clearing in the forest is still there. The scorched circle never grew back. Nothing grows there. The soil is permanently altered, crystallized in geometric patterns that erosion can't touch. Scientists came, real scientists, not the men in suits, and took samples, published papers about unusual silicon formations and unexplained crystalline structures. But they never knew what caused it, never knew what they were really looking at. Sometimes late at night, you can still hear a faint humming if you stand in the exact center of that scorched circle, or maybe that's just in our heads. Hard to say. Memory and experience blur after 20 years. But I've been out there, stood in that spot where the sphere used to sit, and I swear I can feel it. That patient vibration, that fundamental frequency, like an echo that never quite fades. Tom Chen passed away 5 years ago. Heart attack. Patricia found him in his garage, surrounded by papers covered in equations, trying to decode the signal one last time. At his funeral, we noticed he'd written something on the last page of his notebook, underlined 3 times with a shaking hand. They are still listening. I think about that a lot, about the being we saw, about the sphere and the lost time and the marks that never fade, about what it means to be remembered by something that exists beyond our understanding of reality. It's humbling, terrifying, and strangely comforting all at once. Because if that sphere was a rescue pod, if that being was stranded and waiting for retrieval, then the signal we keep hearing means something important. It means whatever sent that sphere succeeded. It means they made it home. It means they remember where they found help. It means that in a vast, cold universe, full of impossible distances and fundamental isolation, connection is possible. Understanding is possible. Help is possible. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars are bright and the forest is quiet, I stand on my porch and look up at the sky. I think about that tall, elegant being stepping into the sphere, about the silent ascent into the dawn, about worlds with mirror-covered surfaces and skies that swirl with mathematical precision, about consciousness that doesn't need bodies, about civilizations that measure time in scales we can't comprehend. And I wonder, if they're still listening, what are they listening for? What are they waiting to hear? Are they watching us, this small town in Wyoming that once sheltered something from beyond our world? Are we being observed by patient awareness that exists light years away? I don't have answers. None of us do. But we have the marks, we have the memories, we have the signal that returns like a ghost reminding us that we were part of something larger than ourselves. We were witnesses to contact, to understanding, to a moment when the vast distance between one form of consciousness and another collapsed. And for just a brief time, we were not alone. If that was a rescue, then whatever sent it is still out there, still watching, still listening, and maybe, just maybe, still grateful to the people of Devil's Hollow who looked up at the impossible and chose not to look away. The question is, what happens when they decide to visit again? I guess we'll find out. Until then, we wait, we listen, and we remember the night everything went silent, and what came after. Because some stories don't end. They just pause, waiting for the next chapter to begin. And I have a feeling, deep in the place where the mark pulses against my palm, that this story isn't over. That the chapter we witnessed was just the beginning. That someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 100 years, something will return to Devil's Hollow. Something will remember us. Something will come back. And when it does, we'll be ready. We'll be watching. We'll be waiting. Because once you've been marked by the stars, once you've had your mind touched by consciousness from another world, you never really stop watching the sky. You never really stop listening for that patient signal. You never really forget what it felt like to stand in the presence of something vast and ancient and fundamentally alien and feel recognized. The marks never fade, the memories never dim, and the story never really ends. It just waits, like we wait, like they wait, until the next chapter begins. There are moments in history when everything changes, yet nothing moves. No explosions, no dramatic arrivals, no lights descending from the heavens. Just a subtle shift in the fabric of reality that most people never notice. This is the story of one such moment. A moment when humanity stopped shouting into the void and realized with creeping horror that the void had been listening all along. Late October in northern Canada, the kind of cold that makes metal brittle and silence absolute. The Whitehorse Deep Space Monitoring Station sat like a forgotten monument to an earlier era of space exploration. Its white geodesic dome cracked and weathered, its parking lot empty except for a single truck with failing heating. Inside, Elliot Crane sat alone. The station was scheduled for permanent closure in 3 weeks. Most of its equipment had already been powered down. The important instruments relocated to newer facilities with better funding and warmer climates. What remained was essentially archaeological. Outdated receivers, analog recording equipment, systems that had been state-of-the-art when Elliot was in elementary school. Elliot himself was an artifact of sorts, a systems technician in his early 40s who preferred the company of machines to people. He had volunteered for this final assignment precisely because it meant solitude. 3 weeks of checking systems, logging data, and ensuring everything was properly archived before the lights went out forever. It was supposed to be boring. It was supposed to be safe. On the evening of October 23rd, Elliot performed his standard overnight systems check. This involved walking through the station's main monitoring room, a circular space beneath the dome, where banks of equipment hummed and clicked with the mechanical rhythm of a dying era. Most screens were dark, most consoles were silent, only one system remained fully active, the wide-band cosmic background receiver, designated Unit 7. Its sole purpose was to log random cosmic noise, the constant static hiss of the universe itself. This data served as a baseline for calibration, nothing more. It was not analysed, it was barely noticed. Until the noise stopped. Elliot first noticed it at 23 minutes past 11. He'd been reviewing temperature logs when something about the monitoring room felt different, Not wrong exactly, just different. Then he realized what it was. The white noise hiss from Unit 7's speakers had changed. For decades, that hiss had been constant, random, chaotic in the way that natural phenomena always are. But now it sounded uniform, smooth, like a single sustained note instead of static. Elliot walked to the console and stared at the display. Every frequency band showed identical activity, perfect uniformity across the entire spectrum. This was impossible. Cosmic background radiation is chaotic by definition. Radio waves from distant stars, particle collisions, quantum, fluctuations, all of it creates a random pattern that never synchronizes. It is one of the few constants in astrophysics. The universe is fundamentally noisy. But on October 23rd, at 23 minutes past 11, the universe went quiet in the most disturbing way possible. Not silent, just uniform. Elliot's first assumption was equipment failure, a stuck relay, a corrupted data stream, something prosaic and fixable. He ran diagnostics. Every system reported normal operation. Signal strength, normal. Antenna positioning, normal. Data processing, normal. The equipment was working perfectly. It was reality that had changed. Elliot sat in the uncomfortable chair, bolted to the monitoring station floor, and stared at the screens. His breath made small clouds in the poorly heated room. Outside, wind rattled the dome with a sound like distant drums. He needed to confirm the system was actually functioning. There was a standard procedure for this, a calibration pulse, a short automated signal transmitted to check timing accuracy. It lasted milliseconds. It was not directional. It was not powerful. It was not meant to accomplish anything except verify that clocks were synchronized. Elliot initiated the pulse at 11:37. The system transmitted a brief chirp of organized radio energy encoded with timing data, then silence. Well, not silence. The uniform hiss continued unchanged. Elliot logged the calibration and turned back to his temperature reports. 8 seconds later, the noise returned. Not the uniform hiss, the real noise, the chaotic, random static of cosmic background radiation, but it returned shaped. Elliot's attention snapped to the display. The signal pattern scrolling across the screen was not random. It was structured. It mirrored the calibration pulse he had just transmitted, but stretched, layered, and harmonically complex, as if something had received his transmission and answered. Elliot's hands were shaking as he saved the data. He played it back 3 times, checking for artifacts, for errors, for anything that would explain what he was seeing. The pattern remained consistent. A response, not a reflection. The timing was wrong for that, not an echo. The structure was too deliberately altered. Something had processed his signal and transmitted a reply. Elliot spent the next hour documenting everything. Exact timestamps, signal characteristics, environmental conditions. He worked with the mechanical precision of someone trying very hard not to think about implications. At 1:15 in the morning, he composed an email to his supervisor, a station manager named Patricia Voss, who worked from an office in Ottawa and had made it clear she considered this entire closure operation a bureaucratic formality. The email was brief, professional. It included all relevant data attachments and a simple request for guidance on whether to repeat the calibration test. Patricia's reply arrived at 1:43. 4 words. Do not repeat test. No explanation. No curiosity. No questions. Just a warning. Elliot stared at those 4 words for a long time. He had worked in government contracting long enough to recognise the tone. This was not the response of someone dismissing a technical glitch. This was the response of someone who recognised something they did not want to acknowledge. He shut down his workstation and walked to the break room. The coffee was hours old and tasted like rust, but he drank it anyway, standing by the window that looked out over kilometres of snow-covered emptiness. Somewhere above that emptiness, something had answered humanity's accidental whisper, and someone in Ottawa already knew what that meant. Elliot did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the monitoring room, watching Unit 7's displays, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The cosmic background noise remained normal, random, chaotic, as if the 8 seconds of impossible response had never occurred. By morning, Elliot had convinced himself he was overreacting. Equipment did strange things. Data did unexpected things. The universe was full of phenomena that seemed impossible until they were explained. But he could not quite dismiss the flatness of Patricia's response. At 9 in the morning, ignoring the explicit instruction he had received, Elliot composed an email to someone who might actually be curious. Marcus Webb had been a colleague years ago, back when Elliot worked at a university research facility. Marcus had moved into academic signal analysis, studying radio patterns from pulsars and using them to test theories about information transmission across cosmic distances. More importantly, Marcus was genuinely interested in anomalies. Elliot's email was casual. He framed it as an interesting curiosity, something weird that happened during equipment shutdown. He attached the data. Marcus replied within 6 hours. The message was 3 sentences long. This is not reflection. This is transformation. Something processed your signal. Elliot called him immediately. Marcus answered on the second ring. Where did you get this data? The Whitehorse Station, background monitoring. I ran a calibration pulse and got this response 8 seconds later. 8 seconds exactly. To the millisecond. Silence on the line. Then Marcus spoke, his voice careful. Elliot, this is not noise. This is structure. Whatever generated this signal took your calibration pulse, analysed it, and returned a harmonically evolved version. That requires processing, intelligence, or a very weird equipment malfunction. Does equipment failure usually create mathematically precise harmonic transformations? Elliot had no answer for that. Marcus continued. Have you checked historical data? Has this happened before? I was told not to investigate further. By whom? My supervisor. Another pause. That is extremely interesting. That evening, Elliot did something he knew he should not do. He accessed the station's archived logs, going back decades, searching for any mention of similar anomalies. The logs were extensive, thousands of entries documenting routine operations, equipment maintenance, calibration tests, and background noise characteristics. Most were unremarkable, but buried in the data, appearing roughly every 10 to 15 years, were brief notations that made Elliot's stomach tighten. August of 2008. Background synchronization event. Duration 4 seconds. No source identified. November of 1993. Unexplained signal uniformity. Investigated. Equipment normal. Event ceased. June of 1978. Cosmic noise collapse. Brief. Resolved without intervention. Each time the same pattern. A short period of impossible uniformity. No explanation. No follow-up. Just a note in the logs, and then nothing. The events had been dismissed because they were brief, because they resolved themselves, and because nothing else happened. Until now. Elliot printed the relevant log entries and spread them across the break room table. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Every decade or so, something caused the cosmic background to synchronize briefly. And every time, the event was ignored, filed away, forgotten. Why? Because following up would mean acknowledging something impossible. And acknowledging something impossible would mean consequences, questions, attention, much easier to log it and move on. Elliot returned to the monitoring room and pulled up the most recent data from Unit 7. The cosmic background noise was behaving normally, random fluctuations across all frequency bands. He initiated another calibration pulse. He did not ask permission. The pulse transmitted at 22 minutes past midnight. 8 seconds later, the response came. But this time, it was different. The signal did not simply mirror the calibration pulse. It evolved. The harmonic structure was more complex, the timing more precise. It was as if whatever was responding had learned from the first exchange, as if it understood better now. Elliot recorded everything. He sent the data to Marcus. He saved multiple backups, and then he waited. The response came again the next night, without any calibration pulse from his end. At exactly 8 seconds past midnight, Unit 7 registered a signal, identical in structure to the responses he had recorded, but unprompted, as if whatever was out there had decided to initiate contact on its own terms. Elliot documented it all. The signals were evolving, not words, not symbols, nothing that resembled human communication. Instead, they showed timing shifts, harmonic layering, patterns that breathed, expanding and contracting like something alive. It was communication without language, structure without syntax, as if the intelligence behind the signals did not understand sound the way humans did. It only understood structure, pattern, relationship. Marcus called him at 2 a.m. "I have been analysing the data you sent. Elliot, this signal is not coming from space." "What do you mean?" "The propagation characteristics are wrong. If this were a distant source, we would see dispersion, delay, degradation. This signal has none of that. It is appearing simultaneously across multiple frequency bands with no time lag." "That is impossible." "Yes, which means our assumptions are wrong. This is not a transmission from a point source. It is something else." "Like what?" "I do not know, but I checked something. I accessed archived data from other monitoring stations, deep-sea cable noise logs, old radio astronomy recordings." "Elliot, the pattern appears everywhere. Brief moments of signal synchronization going back decades, always dismissed as interference, always ignored." Elliot felt something cold settle in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this encounter is not local. It is global. Whatever is responding has been present for a very long time. We just never noticed." That night, Elliot barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of vast patterns moving through empty space, invisible and patient, waiting for the right signal to finally respond. The next morning, he arrived at the station to find his access credentials had been revoked. The door lock blinked red when he tried his keycard. He called Patricia. She answered immediately. "Elliot, you have been removed from this assignment effective immediately." "Why?" "Equipment irregularities. Your access is a liability." "What irregularities?" "That is not your concern anymore. Report to Ottawa for reassignment." "Patricia, something is responding to our signals. You know that. The logs prove it has happened before." Silence. Then Patricia spoke, her voice very quiet. "Elliot, this station is closing. The data will be archived. The equipment will be decommissioned. Whatever you think you observed will be noted in the final report as a calibration anomaly. You need to let this go. Why? Because some questions do not have good answers, and some answers do not lead anywhere useful. The call ended. Elliot sat in his truck, engine running for warmth, staring at the station he could no longer enter. 48 hours after he first noticed the signal, his entire investigation had been shut down. His access revoked, his findings dismissed, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. That evening, Marcus called with more information. I contacted colleagues at other institutions. Everyone has similar data. Brief periods of signal uniformity, always dismissed, always filed away. But Elliot, there is a pattern to when it happens. What pattern? It correlates with advances in global timing technology, GPS satellites, international atomic clock synchronization, fiber optic networks with microsecond timing precision. Every time humanity's technology becomes more temporally synchronized, these events increase in frequency. Why would that matter? Because maybe timing is the language. Maybe this intelligence does not communicate through meaning or symbols. It communicates through structure. And for decades, our signals were too chaotic, too random. But modern technology changed that. We created global timing standards, synchronized clocks, uniform protocols. We finally spoke in a way this presence could recognize. Not intentionally. No, but inevitably. Elliot understood then what had happened. Humanity had not made first contact through deliberate effort, not through SETI, not through carefully composed messages beamed toward distant stars. Instead, contact had occurred as an accident of infrastructure. We built systems that required precise timing, and something noticed, something that existed not as a craft or a being, but as a distributed presence, something that lived in fields, not bodies, something that did not travel, because it was already everywhere, woven into the fabric of electromagnetic reality itself, waiting, listening, until humanity finally spoke clearly enough to be understood. Elliot never returned to the White Horse Station. It was shut down 2 weeks later. The equipment was decommissioned. The data was archived in locations he did not have clearance to access. Officially, the anomalous signals were classified as equipment malfunction, interference, calibration errors. Unofficially, nothing was said at all. But Elliot kept monitoring. Not through official channels, not through government equipment, through publicly available data, radio astronomy archives, deep space monitoring reports, amateur satellite tracking forums. And over the following months, he noticed something. The cosmic background noise was changing, subtly, so subtly that most monitoring systems filtered it out as irrelevant. But it was there, faint patterns, recurring structures, harmonic relationships that should not exist in random noise. The universe sounded organized. Elliot shared his findings with Marcus, who confirmed it independently. "It is everywhere," Marcus said. "Not loud, not obvious, but consistent, as if something is actively maintaining structure in what should be chaos." What does that mean? It means we were noticed, and whatever noticed us is still paying attention. There were no sightings, no lights in the sky, no silver discs hovering over cities. Contact did not arrive in any form humanity had imagined. Instead, it manifested as awareness. Something vast and patient had heard humanity's accidental signal, and instead of visiting, instead of revealing itself, it had simply acknowledged our existence, and now it was listening. Elliot thought about this often, late at night, when the world was quiet and he could almost hear the hum of electromagnetic fields carrying signals across the globe. Humanity had spent decades broadcasting into space, hoping for a response. We sent mathematical formulas, cultural information, maps showing our location, all of it deliberate, all of it intentional, and all of it ignored. Because we were shouting in a language no one spoke. But when we built GPS satellites, when we synchronized atomic clocks across continents, when we created technology that required microsecond precision across global networks, we finally said something comprehensible. Not a greeting, not a message, just structure. And something answered, not with words, not with ships, but with attention. 6 months after the White Horse Station closed, Elliot received an unmarked envelope at his new assignment. Inside was a single piece of paper, a graph showing cosmic background measurements from multiple monitoring stations across the globe. The patterns were unmistakable now. Synchronized, structured, intentional. At the bottom of the page, someone had written a single sentence in pen. This should not continue. Elliot kept the paper. He also kept monitoring, because the truth was already loose, not in dramatic revelations or government press conferences, but in the quiet accumulation of data, in the subtle changes to background noise that careful observers were beginning to notice. Humanity had made contact, not through intention, but through infrastructure, and whatever had made contact in return was not going away. It was embedding itself deeper into the electromagnetic spectrum, learning, adapting, waiting to see what humanity would do next. Elliot sometimes wondered what would happen when the presence decided to move beyond listening, when acknowledgement became interaction, when the patterns in the noise resolved into something unmistakable. But for now, the contact remained quiet. A presence in the static, a structure in the chaos, proof that we were no longer alone, and proof that we had been noticed by something that did not think the way we did not exist the way we did, and did not want the same things we wanted. As something that had been waiting a very long time, and was now fully aware of our existence. On a cold night in late March, Elliot initiated one final calibration pulse from a university radio telescope where Marcus worked. They waited. 8 seconds later, the response came. But this time, it did not mirror their signal. It anticipated it. The response arrived 7 seconds after transmission, then 6 seconds, then 5. The presence was learning, understanding, adapting to human timing, human patterns, human structure. It was closing the gap between signal and response, moving from acknowledgement towards something that looked disturbingly like conversation. Marcus and Elliot stared at the data in silence. Finally, Marcus spoke. "What do we do?" Elliot did not have an answer. Humanity had asked if anyone was out there. The universe had answered, not with a visit, but with attention. And now something vast and patient and utterly alien was learning to speak our language. Not because it wanted to communicate meaning, but because it wanted to understand structure. And once it understood structure, what would it do? Elliot shut down the equipment and walked outside. The sky was clear, stars scattered across the darkness in familiar patterns. Somewhere among those stars, conventional wisdom said intelligent life might exist, but the truth was closer and stranger, and it had been listening all along. We never asked if anyone was out there. We just built systems loud enough to be noticed, and the universe finally answered, not with a visit, but with attention. The question now was what came next. What happened when attention became intention? When listening became action? When the quiet contact stopped being quiet. Elliot looked up at the stars and felt the weight of all the electromagnetic signals humanity had ever transmitted, spreading outward at the speed of light, announcing our presence to a universe we barely understood. And somewhere in the fabric of that universe, something was listening, learning, waiting. The age of accidental contact had begun, and there was no going back.